Hey, I'm John Nervaj with Our Revolution Colorado Springs. With me today is Ryan Lucas, who was a candidate for CD5 not too long ago. I think it was probably about a month, probably about 2 months since we last talked. And a
hmm
lot has transpired in the last couple months for sure. One of them being obviously the coronavirus that we are experiencing today. I remember you
hmm
when we had our discussion. You had a lot of experience in sort of this like the healthcare industry, and I thought it'd be really interesting to see your perspective and kind of what you know your current thoughts are based off of what we're seeing with this pandemic.
Yeah, certainly. So, I work in the behavioral health space. So, I'm not a doctor myself. I don't, I'm not a clinician of any sort. So I can't really speak to the physical aspects of what is happening presently with this virus. I think there are plenty of experts that are out there that are giving us really good information around how we can mitigate the disease and flatten the curve and whatnot. I can speak a little bit to what our experience has been as a healthcare industry, and also in terms of access and what's being done to be able to support people. So, one of the things that as we started to look at the landscape, as we saw that states like California and New York were implementing stay-at-home orders and essential employee orders, that really pushed us at our company, which is based in Littleton, Colorado, to start preparing for the same orders to come through in Colorado. I think it was as soon as California announced it, I said, all right, Colorado's going to come, within a matter of days. What do we need to do in order for us to be prepared for that? And the leadership team of my company had been kind of thinking about what we wanted to do, what would happen if we had an employee who, came into contact with COVID-19, and how we wanted to manage that. So we certainly had started to prepare ahead of time. I had spent several years moving the majority of our operations to the cloud in various ways. Literally for probably 2 or 3 years, I had been actively moving systems off site. So when it came down to making our company be able to comply with the stay-at-home order, even though our company would still be classified as essential business because we're in the healthcare industry, in order to help to mitigate our risk as quickly as possible, and bearing in mind that we have a very heavy call center operation as a part of our company, we were able to convert our call center operations over to remote services very, very quickly. I think it was literally, I had been working 80%. Actually, I'm still working 80% in terms of my work load at the office. So I had, it was maybe 3 Mondays ago, I was off for that day, but I came in the following Tuesday morning. I was asked how quickly we could get the phone operations up and running in the cloud. The following Monday, we shut off all local services and were 100% in the cloud. So it was 4 business days, and we were live with those operations. No more staff coming into the office, at least call center staff. We still have some people that still have to come into the office because they deal with physical things, right? So, if you think about accounting and operations, where you still have pieces of mail that are coming in that are still being managed, but we were able to get our services mostly being managed remotely. But what I'll say in terms of the utilization of services, we've actually been very surprised that there was a pretty significant dip in requests for services, likely because people were trying to really kind of take care of their own homes and make sure that they were prepared physically. It's sort of Maslow's hierarchy, right? So the first thing you have to do is you have to make sure you've got shelter and food, and then you start to deal with things like your mental well-being. So we're starting to see that now. We've seen an uptick in people accessing services specifically around anxiety with COVID-19, and Also dealing with their workplaces, right? So, I think it was announced today, 6.6 million unemployment claims that have come through in the last 2 weeks. We're certainly seeing a lot of anxiety about, people not having a job or what they're going to do if they end up losing their job, or there are companies that are actually downsizing in light of this. They can't afford to cover their employees because they're cash flow, light businesses where, they may not necessarily be able to support an employee base for 2 or 3 weeks without being able to have any revenue coming in the door. So when those businesses, all intents and purposes of the CARE Act, which is supposed to be getting money into those businesses so that they can keep those employees on, but that money isn't even being applied for until this week, right? So we're talking about 2 weeks in before they can apply for the funds. Let's say things go very, very well and administratively that money comes very quickly. You're still probably talking another 2-3 weeks before those businesses have money in their accounts where they can start paying payroll again. So, for a 4 to 5 week period, that lag is really painful for for small businesses, for employees of those small businesses, where the cash flow just it's not supportive of being able to, keep those employees paid at the levels that they've been paid, which is why the $1,200, direct payment is just, it's dumbfounding that that's the number that we landed on, because and while the calculation works out that that's basically minimum wage over a month-long period, a lot of people don't make minimum wage and they really do have bills that have to be paid. So it's going to be tight for a lot of people. We're starting to see some of those concerns around career, coming into our doors. Certainly, we wanted to make sure that we were going to be 100% there to be able to support people, as they're going into these more and more trying times, because now that we are starting to deal with some of the physical elements, right? So people are starting to become more comfortable with using, telecommunication platforms like this to be able to do meetings, and, there's less going out, which is great. We're starting to decrease our risk of interactions that could potentially spread contagion. But that, as people become more comfortable with those things, then you have more space to be able to focus on, am I going to have a job in 2 weeks, or how am I going to be able to afford increased costs in various ways, right? I mean, as people are trying to stockpile a bunch of supplies, there's direct costs related to that, and sure, that may defer costs later on down the road, or it may not. I mean, I think that's a reality that's not yet known for a lot of people, and I think it does, exacerbate the anxiety that people feel generally around the disease,
Yeah.
and the news reports that people are getting.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, and you brought up an interesting point too about sort of the economic anxiety that people are facing, and how the CARE Act is meant to alleviate some of that. I'm curious what your thoughts on that sort of legislation was. I mean, I ultimately agree with what you said about the 1,200 being not really enough to keep people afloat. And I know there was a lot of proposals and counter proposals. You're gonna see my cat in the shot. I couldn't stop that one. But yeah, there's a lot of counter proposals of 2,000, up to 2,000 a month, I believe, was what AOC was proposing in the House, and what Bernie Sanders was proposing in the Senate. I'm curious on what your thoughts are on some of the on what ultimately was passed, and if you feel like that was adequate or enough.
Well, I think, and as to what what was going through the heads of the lawmakers, I don't think that we're really going to know. I try not to suppose that there is an evil party and a good party, that there's a party out there that's really just trying to support corporations, and a party out there that's out there just to support the working man. I think that the gradations between those parties is much more fine than a lot of people make it out to be. But I also think that when that act was passed, I think people actually thought that this was going to be a 15-day Band-Aid and not a 45-day Band-Aid. And it was funny because I was listening to the coronavirus task force earlier today, and Pence made a comment about 30 days to slow the spread. Well, last week it was 15 days to slow the spread, and I'm very glad that and then he even made a reference to the fact that we're on day 2 of that, and just total blowing over the fact that we just went through a 15 days where that was supposed to be our 15 days to slow the spread. Now it's 30 days. It was very Orwellian in the way that it played out in the broadcast. But I think that there's probably going to have to be additional legislation that is there to support direct support for families and people, just to be able to support everyday living expenses. I think the $2,000. I know Canada has implemented a $2,000 a month, and it's for 3 months, I believe, 3 or 4 months that they handled right out of the gate. We certainly can support it. We know that we have the ability to do something like that. I would imagine that in a second round bill that there's going to have to be a lot more money for direct payments to be able to support people, and probably greater support through third parties, right, where they're able to make direct payments on behalf of the federal government, as opposed to the IRS being the group that's actually distributing those checks, or the Treasury is actually distributing those checks, but they're maybe going through a third party beneficiary where they're able to help with making determinations on how they can distribute money in effective ways. Looking at the way that they've constructed this, the original guidelines for who is going to be receiving or not receiving those payments, I know that my family is likely going to be receiving one of those checks, and I, my wife and I were dual income family, but we don't do poorly for ourselves. We are not a family that needs that check. And I wish that there was a way for us to easily say, a lot of people are wondering, oh, how do we get that check? How do we get that check? And I'm like, how do we send that check back? We are not the people who need that check right now. I've got a freezer full of meat that's being delivered in a week because I get a freezer full of meat delivered every 6 months. We're good. We're going to be good on food. We're good on toilet paper. We got all the meds that we need here. We don't need that $1,200 check. We need other people to have that $1,200 check. So, I imagine that there will be another iteration of that bill that will end up coming through where there's increased direct payments. I don't imagine that there's going to be another direct infusion of cash into the 3 major industries that were identified in the first CARES Act, that that the airline industry, the cargo industry. I don't think that that'll probably happen in the second round, but we'll see what happens. I mean, the negotiations on that, I don't even know have even really been started. And right now, the House is focused on trying to set up oversight over the first CARES Act, not working on the second CARES Act, as far as I've been able to see. So, if that, I think we need to start looking at, what the next round of direct payments are going to look like.
Yeah. I mean, it's record level legislation passed, very quickly, all things considered.
Yeah.
And I ultimately agree. I think an approach to support people who are more on the lower income, because those are typically the people who, are filing for unemployment, or the service industry. Restaurants don't need to have wait staff because all the restaurants are doing delivery or closed.
Right.
So the lower income seems like they should have a higher distribution of that, of those checks coming into them, rather than just kind of like a flat $1,200 unless you make 75, then it kind of tapers off. I agree with you, and that doesn't really necessarily seem right. I guess
Well,
my
and it's
next,
also just to
yeah,
throw out just as a quick aside, because it's also the calculation on that is also based on previous tax returns. So you're not even talking about where people are currently. You're
exactly.
talking about, I think it's the 2018 tax return is what they're looking at. So you're talking about wages that, it came from 2017 or 2018 is how they're determining whether or not somebody falls below that 75,000 threshold. Um, that's problematic when somebody has potentially gotten a massive promotion or a change in job where they could potentially be pulling in 250,000 a year now, and we're going to send them a $1,200 check. It's we did talk about it um, quite a lot the day that the Senate was supposed to be voting on the first version, and then it ended up getting delayed, and how similar it looks to UBI in terms of that $1,200. And we had talked about how it's it doesn't fit the definition of universal. It doesn't fit the definition of basic necessarily, but it is this kind of mass infusion of cash into the economy by giving consumers the ability to spend money, and to stave off debt. But ultimately, the in terms of whether or not you want means testing to be included in a UBI, you don't, right? You want a base level for all people. That's the purpose of a UBI. That's another one of the critical ways that I don't view this as a UBI situation, right? We're dealing with a particular crisis. We're not talking about setting up long-term, outcomes of stability in somebody's personal finances. We're talking about stabilizing their current financial crisis, right? And that to me means that we need to be looking at making sure that we're getting money to the people who really need it, not across the board.
Yeah.
Which I would say up to $75,000, $150,000 for a couple. That's not really need at that point. But again, a lot of that also comes down to whether or not they have continued employment. What's going to happen to them, during this crisis, right? And certainly, the restaurant owner that's had to shut down their business, where they're not getting a paycheck from their own businesses right now. Even if they were in that $150,000 to $200,000 a year, personal income, they could potentially be at $0 income right now. So I think certainly there are gradations on that, but I don't have the answer to all of it, but I think that there's still quite a bit of work
Yeah.
to be done.
Yeah, and just so moving on, I think the other aspect of this is just like our government's response, just in general, as far as like how fast they were able to really see the crisis for what it was, and the very confusing timelines, like you mentioned about 15-month or 15-day. Then now it's 30-day, and then I mean, who knows? It seems like a decade ago that the month of March started. So
Yeah, right. The
information
decade of March.
yeah, the decade of March. So a lot can change.
Yeah.
I'm curious about perfect timing, Kat. I'm curious about just like your opinion of like this the government's response overall, and basically what you kind of think about that.
I the fact, I think that the speed with which the House and Senate were able to get the original version of the act done was significant. I mean, you said it a moment ago. It was a huge piece of legislation. It was signed off very quickly. There was certainly negotiation that went into that, and I think that was good because we got a better bill out of that negotiation. The original version of the bill was not a bill that I, for one, would have ended up supporting. The final version, I think, was it was a relatively good bill in that it made sure that we were keeping oversight over the dollars that were being spent to bail out companies that potentially could falter during that time. And let's make no mistake that in order for people to have wealth, we do have to have jobs. We do have to have corporations that are there to support those jobs. So, I think making sure that those companies stayed healthy through that time period was an important step for us to make. And I think that they did that relatively quickly. To the point about the shifting timeline, now we have more work to do, and we'll see what that second round really looks like. I'm not willing to say yet that the government has done a good job, because it was only a Band-Aid for a short period of time, and we've already missed the window for which that time was meant to be managed, right? So we've got more work that has to be done. Let's see what the second round looks like. I would advise or encourage the House and Senate to get that done as quickly as possible, to get more money out to people as quickly as possible.
Yeah, but I'm thinking more too about I don't even believe the Trump administration has even issued like a recommendation for states to have like a stay-at-home order. There's still a lot of states that don't have stay-at-home orders. Obviously, Colorado.
11 states. Yeah.
11 states. Yeah, and Colorado acted relatively quickly. As they started to see the crisis unfold in our home in Colorado Springs, El Paso County in particular. I'm curious if what your opinion is then on really if you feel like the Trump administration has taken the proper steps and done the right types of communications.
Well, certainly not. I mean, I think this administration is doing about what I would have expected, which is a lot of bluster, a lot of inaction, and ultimately, is resulting in a lot of danger for the citizens in this country. I think that I appreciate the logic behind the statement of, well, we do need to respect states' rights, and we want to make sure that states are able to make decisions that are in their best interest. But at this point, we know that it's no longer a state's best interest problem. This is a country-wide and worldwide problem that we need to act aggressively on. The fact that the governor of Alabama didn't know that you could spread the disease without being symptomatic is scary for me. That's an entire state that is potentially, brewing new problems for the entire rest of the country. And the whole point of flatten the curve is to decrease the potential pull on the healthcare industry, right? It's not to decrease the spread of the disease. The disease is going to spread, right? It's just a matter of how quickly people are impacted by that disease at the same time. That's the goal. So when you have states like Florida, which, I knew somebody who was in Florida last week who was out on the beach while people were out, having a good old time on the beach in Florida. We know what that ends up turning into. We know what happened in Michigan, in Detroit. We know what's happening in New Orleans. These are both towns that did not have quite the action as quickly as they should have had, especially with major in New Orleans, especially with major public events that were happening around that time period. And then we're surprised when there's suddenly a massive death toll coming out of those areas. Areas of higher concentration of people. And let me just throw out as well, I think it's incredibly irresponsible for the state of Florida to exempt church services from, include them as essential services as a part of their stay-at-home order that's coming out in Florida. I mean, I grew up going to church every single Sunday, almost every single Wednesday night. I was Catholic. I went to church as often as I could. But that's a very close proximity event. I mean, you're cramped. There's no room in those pews. So they're not going to be following the 6 feet rule. They're hopefully, there won't be things such as communion, which are occurring, or, shaking hands with your neighbors and wishing them peace in their lives. Those are things that are so critically important to a lot of people in faith as a part of that ceremony, and the fact that those are going to be qualified as essential to me is incredibly irresponsible. And I think that we're going to see an uptick in cases around those states. So, you know, to get back to your question about response and timing, I think that you know, the time was 2 weeks ago for Trump to make that statement. You know, in terms of his rhetoric around this disease, I find it to be atrocious. Here's what else I'll tell you. I got into an argument with somebody on Twitter today because our own representative, Doug Lamborn, posted a tweet, I think it was yesterday, and I was responding to it today, that COVID-19 stood for Chinese originated virus something, or a virus in December 2019 or something like that. And I'm flabbergasted that a representative of the government, a representative of these of the people in this district, would be spreading that sort of nonsense on Twitter rather than focusing on coming up with the solutions that people need right now to solve this crisis. It's hateful. It's incorrect. And then someone came, you know, after me and said, "Well, he's not incorrect. It did come from China," and which was not at all what I was saying. What I was saying was the COVID-19 stands for Coronavirus Disease 19. And for you to suggest, as the WHO has said, that they will no longer mark diseases as to where they come from because of the bigotry that can be attributed to that disease. There is nothing in the name of that disease that has anything to do with China, and to suggest in any way otherwise is not only irresponsible and wrong. It's underneath the status of the office for which he should hold himself.
Yeah, and I mean, there's been an increase of hate crimes to the Asian population because of that sort of rhetoric spread by him, obviously by President Trump. And and a lot of other senior leaders in the Republican Party. And it's sad that, you know, again, the person who currently represents me in the United States House of Representatives is spreading that sort of like hatred. It's incredibly sad, incredibly disappointing.
And you deserve better than that.
Yeah. So lastly, just to close this out, so there was a county convention took place last week. I was actually just pretty impressed. So I have heard that you have decided to suspend your campaign. But I mean, the results from that county convention, I think, are pretty impressive. The fact that your campaign was roughly over the span of 3 months, and you received 20% of the delegates in that short of a time. I mean, that's honestly pretty impressive. And I think it's a testament to your ability to communicate and really engage with people in the community. And I'm just kind of curious about what your plans are in the future, if you plan to still be politically active in the local Democratic Party, and just kind of what your plan is moving forward.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. You know, we were really honored to get the delegates that we did, and El Paso County is a huge portion of CD5 when it comes to population. I want to say it was 323 delegates total that come out of El Paso County, as opposed to, for example, in Chaffee County, there are 15 delegates. In Park County, there are 5 delegates. In Teller County, there are 11 delegates. So just to kind of give you a sense, and I'm not certain on Fremont what the number is, and I don't think if their delegates have been announced yet, but it should be coming out fairly shortly if it hasn't yet. So, you know, we did about that 20% across the entire district. So, you know, it was 20% in Park County. I believe it was, so we got 2 out of 11 in Teller County. We received 3 out of 15 in Chaffee County. So it was in that 18 to 20% range in all of the counties. And I couldn't be more thankful to all of the delegates that I talked to. that supported this campaign, the people who volunteered on this campaign. When we first set out, we had to adapt a lot in that 3-month period. My campaign was announced on January 5th. I believe it was January 4th or January 5th. We announced the campaign. On January 20th, we announced that we were going to go through the petition process. I was an organizer in Chicago. I love petitions. It's my favorite way to start an election. Because it really does get the candidate at the door. And now, as the candidate myself, it was a great way for me to get to the doors, to actually start talking to people. I did collect signatures in every county in CD5. I took trips out to be able to, I stayed overnight in Buena Vista one night. So I did petition collections in Chaffee and then in Park County. I was able to go out into Teller County for an evening and be able to collect petition signatures out there. So it was a good way for me to start to get a sense for where people were in terms of what they wanted to see from their next representative. So we were planning on going the petition route. I was convinced shortly thereafter, probably the second week of February or third week of February, that we wanted to do a combined route between petition collection and the assembly process. The deciding factor in that was ultimately that it would give us the opportunity to really connect more with the Democratic Party directly. And being a newcomer to the district, I mean, I've lived in Colorado Springs for a year now. I've lived in Colorado for 13 years, but I've lived in Colorado Springs for a year. It was a really good opportunity for me to really start to make connections into the county party instead of doing a separate process, a petition process, which is really just a Secretary of State process. So I was convinced to do both routes. The nice thing about going both routes, and this is maybe a little too inside baseball, but if you collect the 1,500 signatures to go through the Secretary of State's route, you only have to get 10% of the assembly. So as opposed to if you're going the assembly only route, you have to receive 30% of the delegates. With the COVID-19 announcement or the shifts that started to happen with COVID-19, we shuttered our petition operation. There was not an extension of the petition operation, not that it would have made a difference, because I had volunteers that had pulmonary fibrosis, and volunteers that had family members are at home that were, in vulnerable populations. So that would have been a vector for infection. And I myself, one of my big concerns was I am a handshaker. I like to be out meeting people and talking to people, and I have always appreciated, a good handshake and the trust that touch can build between two people. So, I myself was concerned that I would become a vector for infection, right? Because I would literally be carrying from one person to another. So we had to end the petitions, which meant that we were back into the situation where we had to get 30% of the assembly. And so when we saw the numbers come out of El Paso County, that pretty much solidified for us that there was no path forward through the Democratic Party to be able to access the ballot. So at that point, in the interest of party unity, so that Jillian will have the strongest campaign going forward to take on this representative who likes to hate on Twitter. We decided that it was in the best interest of the campaign to go ahead and hand over the reins to Jillian, so that she can take Representative Lamborn. So we did make that announcement. Shortly thereafter, I wanted to make sure that I had spoken with our supporters and our donors, made sure that we had a proper meeting with our candidate committee. So we actually took an official vote to shutter the campaign. It wasn't my decision alone. And we decided to shutter the campaign a few hours after the El Paso County results came through.
Interesting. So yeah, I'm just curious then. So what, like, kind of the next steps then, like, I imagine you still plan on being active in our, local party and, potentially look at other things. Are you going to continue to, kind of throw your support behind Jillian and help her campaign as well?
Yeah. I'll do everything that I can to support her campaign. I want nothing more than for her and the Democratic Party to be successful in this election right now. To your earlier point, I'm going to stay active and involved in this county, and potentially in this district, in other ways. I said early on in my campaign, and repeated it many times in conversation with delegates going into the county assemblies. I have decided to make Colorado Springs my home for the next 10 years. We have a 9-year-old. They are in the D11 school district. It's going to be 10 years before they leave off for college or trade school or whatever it is that they end up doing after high school. This is my home for the next 10 years. And what's true is I have never in my entire life had an expectation that I was living somewhere for 10 years. So as far as I know, this is my home in a way that no home has ever been for me. So I will continue to push, as best I can, as best as people see fit to use me to be able to continue to push for progressive change in this country, and whether that comes from the private sector or the public sector or running for office again. My goal has always been to support the people that need support to be able to do the big things that we need to do in this country. That's been the underlying reason for every job I've taken. It's the reason why I volunteer for the organizations I volunteer for. It's the reason that I've started the companies that I have started. All of these things have always been about supporting people who want to make changes, societal changes, cultural changes, big changes that they see that they want to make, and I will continue to do that in whatever form ends up coming my way. Right now we're looking at how we might be able to transition. There are no resources of the campaign at this point because we spent every single dollar that we had all the way up through the end. We spent it responsibly, but we spent it efficiently all the way down to the last day. I think in the end, I have $40 left over in this campaign, so I think that we did pretty well. But we're looking at what kind of transition for the energy that we were able to build in this campaign might look like, right? So the resources, the contacts that we built to be able to support other campaigns that are interested in building consensus platforms, and helping to build up those candidates and be able to support them so that they can continue to be successful in making the progressive change that we need in this country.
Awesome. Well, yeah, again, I appreciate, your voice and your passion. Really excited to, see what really the future holds. And again, thanks for sitting down with us today. Again, this is really good, insightful, and learn a lot too, especially with your perspective of what, you're currently facing at your company. So again, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, and thank you so much for asking me to do another one of these interviews. I'm happy to do these with you all anytime you want to. I think it's so important the way that you built out this community and built out this audience and this format. I think it's been really good to give longer format interviews that kind of dig a little bit deeper into issues than what you'll oftentimes see at for example, a candidate forum. So I appreciate the work that you and Josh do. To really kind of give voice to a lot of different perspectives to make sure that people are hearing those perspectives. So thank you so much for the invitation.